Hi, folks. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and I am coming to you this week for the first time from, I was going to say sunny Hood River, Oregon, but it is not sunny here in Hood River, Oregon. Actually, it is at the moment, but it's been raining for like a week straight. So, anyway, you'll notice there's a new location, and the background I've got here is amazingly bland. Hopefully, I've got some good natural light coming in from a window that's up there, and this all works out okay. But, so far, so good. Anyway, my travels aside, this week's question on the freelancer Q&A that I do here is, what software should I use for my books? So this is from somebody who is contemplating setting off on their own. And this is a question that they have that is kind of granular and specific, but for those of you who might not be familiar with the lingo, they mean books, like keeping books, bookkeeping, essentially finances, like how do they keep track of invoices, payments, that kind of thing. And I have talked about things like this here on the channel / community before. I don't know if I've ever answered this specific question. It'd be interesting to see if I, answered this 2 years ago, if I give the same answer now that I did then. But let's dive into that. The short version of this, what I would recommend generally, and again, this is kind of like videos I do in the past. I'm not an accountant. Do not construe this as me necessarily telling you what you should do in the form of financial advice. It's more like what I would advise myself if a different version of me were just starting out, and or what I would do if I were in this position. So that caveat aside, the easy answer, the answer I would give by default is when you first set off on your own, start with a spreadsheet for keeping your books. And then eventually you might want to go to QuickBooks. And I mean specifically QuickBooks, not Xero, not Zoho, not whatever, Mint, I don't know, specifically QuickBooks. And I'll tell you why I say that in a bit. But for both the person asking this question and for anyone in this position in general, I think there's an important thing to decide for yourself up front. And that's, do you want to, in the early going, DIY with your personal with your freelance practices, finance, and books, or do you want to go with an accountant right out of the gate? And there's no right or wrong answer to this. I personally think you should DIY for a while, and I'll tell you why that is, but just understand up front, it's kind of a matter of preference, and it's ultimately going to be down to how comfortable with you are you with kind of learning and figuring out the books on the fly versus, do you just want nothing to do with that? You don't trust yourself, etc. So you can go either way. The reason that I recommend DIYing, it's what I did. And what wound up happening for me was this, I'll call it boiled frog syndrome in a good way. Now, for those of you who don't know what that macabre sounding metaphor is, the idea of boiled frog syndrome, it's usually bad. The idea is, like, the imagery that comes to mind is if you try to drop a frog into a pot of boiling water, I guess you're going to cook the frog will try to jump out. But if you put a frog into a pot of room temperature water and then gradually increase the temperature over time, so the saying goes, the frog will just stay in there until the water boils, because there's no one temperature change that prompts it to want to leave. And this is applied to often, situations in your life where things get to be really bad, but it happens so gradually that there's never a moment where you say, I can't take this anymore, I'm not going to do it. You just find that you're in kind of bad straits. So here, when I think of my relationship with personal and then business finance, I think of it as boiled frog, but in a productive way. I started out using something, I think at the time, was it Quicken or MS Money? I don't know, like 20 years ago when I first graduated college, I had like a checking account and a savings account and maybe like a gas card. And I actually said, well, I'm going to go get a hold of bookkeeping software, personal bookkeeping software. It's probably Quicken, because I've been using that for 20 years. And it was really simple then, just to set up like 2 general ledgers, one for checking, one for savings, and I guess a third for the credit card. And so I learned with the simplest possible personal finances, and I got in the habit of keeping my personal books that way. Over the course of 10 years, I started to build up mortgage accounts and retirement brokerage accounts and, auto loan accounts and all these types of things, credit cards. And there was no moment where the next incremental account was all that hard to figure out. When the time came to like record the mortgage that I took out, I more or less understood how to do that because I had had an auto loan, which is a similar kind of principle. And so over the years, I developed a fairly sophisticated uh, ability to manage my personal finances. When the time came to hang out my shingle and be a freelancer, which I did maybe 13 years ago while I was moonlighting, it was just a matter of upgrading from Quicken Personal to like Quicken Home and Small Business, and a freelancer's business accounts booking is quite simple. So it was not much of a jump from my personal, which had become more and more sophisticated, to managing my businesses accounts there as well. So for the entire time that I was running Dead Tech as a services based business up until, well, things got complicated because I wound up starting or partnering on a few more businesses. I've had several businesses over the years now, but I just kept managing the books that way on sort of a long timeline. And so I got a more and more sophisticated understanding of how to manage a service-based business's books. Eventually, when we started Hit Subscribe, I enlisted help on the bookkeeping side. But at first, it was just Angela, who now runs our operation finance, but just kind of like part-time, logging transactions and stuff. And then I handed off more and more of that over the course of time. And as Hit Subscribe grew, we actually brought in bookkeeping help under Angela, and now we have controller services, fractional CFO, on demand. So there's a lot going on there. The business's finances, Hit Subscribe is a significant enough business that it has escaped my knowledge of how one should best do the bookkeeping. But it took a pretty long time just because of my journey from checking, savings, and gas card to the point where I started to hand this off and lose track of business finance. But that point occurred, with a pretty decent working knowledge of business finance as a bookkeeper and even sort of as a controller. Now, I went too far. I waited too long before washing my hands of some of these things, and that is kind of a tendency of mine, is to DIY past the point when I should. So I don't necessarily advise that you take things as far as I did. But if you start out, it is not going to be rocket science to manage the books of a freelance practice. And I personally think that what you learn about business accounting is valuable. If you later grow your practice beyond just being you as an individual, you bring in a bookkeeper, having that knowledge of how the books work makes you equipped, probably better equipped to be a CEO or a business leader or a managing director of a practice, or just anyone in the C-suite, to have at least a basic understanding of business books. I do think that's valuable because you know what to ask for. You know how concepts work, like amortizing your costs and your revenue over the course of time for predictability. You understand how to do double entry. You understand moving money between accounts, and so on and so forth. And I think being able to speak intelligently about those things for somebody in a C-suite or running a practice is important, even if you're not doing them, even if you're not an expert in them. Just my take. Now, that said, if you have no interest in it, you think you'd be bad at it, you think you would fumble it, and you're perfectly content to let somebody advise you on it forever, that is perfectly valid. A lot of people start businesses that way and have plenty of success. So, either way that you want to do it, it's just, if, in a similar position, I would do what I did again. I just probably get out of it a little bit earlier. So I think there's a lot to be said for DIYing your finances. I would recommend going that route. Now, getting off my kind of small soapbox, so that's not a hill I want to die on, but getting off my soapbox about what you should do. In terms of what you should use for the books, let me start out with, if you decide to go the non-DIY route, if you decide to bring in a bookkeeper, go with what that person uses. Do not try to micromanage that decision. Let that professional use, in their expert opinion, the best piece of software to use there. And the reason I'm saying this is because I know a lot of you that watch this are software engineers by trade, and you're probably going to say things like, oh, but what kind of API does it have? And what if I want to integrate it? And stop right there. Don't do that. Do not do that. Do not build software. And I've made this mistake too. You're going to think, okay, I want the accountant to use XYZ because it has the best API and I've heard great things about it. And I have these grand plans to automate and blah. But number one, don't do that. Don't build line of business systems for your practice. Do not do that. Number two, If you are going to do that, there's nothing that some slick API is doing that you can't get from exporting a CSV of your general ledger or whatever. Like any of these softwares that you use will export your transactions if you want. So do not think about things like that. You will, I promise you, have the capability to get stuff out of that system. So let the professional that you decide to work with decide what tools to use. Do not try to get involved in that decision. Now, if you really and truly cannot help yourself and you have to get involved in that decision, then don't try to get a bookkeeper or a person to use something they're not comfortable with. Instead, find a bookkeeper that uses the tool that you want them to use. So to say that a different way, if you decide you want them to use Xero, Xero or whatever, don't go find a bookkeeper and then insist that that person use Xero. They'll probably refuse. And if they don't, they should. Go out and look for bookkeepers that are already using Xero if you're going to do that. So that is my advice to you if you are DIYing. Try to keep your grubby paws off of that decision and let your bookkeeper decide. But if you must, just pick a bookkeeper that's using the thing that you want to use. If you are not DIYing, then the thing I would, or if you are DIYing, I'm sorry, then I would start out with a spreadsheet. The reason I would start out with a spreadsheet is the spreadsheet is going to be imminently portable to anything you later decide that you want to use. So starting out with some kind of spreadsheet that you're backing up to keep track of your invoices and your payments and so on and so forth. As soon as you decide to get into an accounting package of some kind, you will be able to make that move. You will be able to import your transactions if you keep reasonable books. Now, I wouldn't stick with that too long personally, but understand that when you're first starting out, this is the sum total of how your business finances are going to work. You are go out, get a bank account. If you haven't already, I've probably talked about this. I'll try to find it on YouTube. But when you're just getting going, you want to go out and have a business banking account or a business banking and 2 accounts, I would suggest. Well, 3, I guess. Checking, savings, and a credit card. That would be my recommendation. I won't go into why because I've probably covered that before and it's a little out of scope. But assume you're going to go get those. You have business checking, business savings, and a business credit card. Now, you're also going to send invoices. And the sum total of your business finances is going to be you send invoices, and you want to keep track of the invoices that you're sending. That is what's known as accounts receivable to you. So you might have a tab on the spreadsheet or something for accounts receivable, invoices that you've sent, and you could actually link to wherever you're generating these invoices or just use like a Word doc template. So you're going to, on the one hand, track invoices. Then you're also going to track whether those invoices are paid. You want to understand who owes you money and then reconcile when it gets paid. And then when those invoices are paid, that's going to correspond to an entry in your business checking account. So what's going to happen is you have invoices. They are going to be receivables. Then they're going to get paid. And when they get paid, you get money into your checking account. Now, on the cost side of the ledger, you are going to use your credit card to pay for your expenses, probably nominal, but things like hosting, whatever it is you're doing. So you're going to pay for those. They're going to hit your credit card, and then periodically you're going to pay off your credit card balance. That money comes out of your checking. Finally, you are going to use your savings, my recommendation, to set aside money anytime you collect an invoice to pay quarterly estimated taxes. I would use the savings account pretty much just for that, unless you want to stash money there to see how your liquidity is growing. But what I would recommend doing is just using that savings account to set aside about 30% of what you're paid. And then once a quarter, you just empty that out into the IRS and state government coffers. Now, you will be able to keep track of all of that or a subset of it pretty easily with just a spreadsheet. At the thinnest, you could just keep track of your invoices and then make a notation as to when they're paid, and then use your business's bank account, web portal or whatever, to look at your transactions, meaning the only thing you need to keep track of outside of your bank login is probably that you've sent customer XYZ an invoice number 123, and that, hey, I got paid for this. Like, you could get by just with a spreadsheet tracking what invoices you've sent and when you were paid. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this for very long. Frankly, I would recommend doing this only until you've got a few invoices going, just because I don't know if I would get set up with bookkeeping software right out of the gate, like before you actually have any invoices or a bank account or anything. But once you've sent out a few invoices and you get to understand the system, I would pretty quickly get some bookkeeping software and get everything into that bookkeeping software. And the piece of software that I would recommend to finally get around to answering the question is QuickBooks. I maybe mentioned that earlier. But QuickBooks is, it kind of sucks or has sucked over it is not my favorite piece of software. And it sounds weird that I am wholeheartedly all in recommending something that's not my favorite piece. It's getting better. Right? We use it for hit subscribe. But I remember like 7-8 years ago, I hated it to the point where I went and tried a series of other pieces of bookkeeping software. And I have learned the hard way, just use QuickBooks. And here's why. If you're going to use something like Xero or we use Zoho Books for a long time with hit subscribe, um, those pieces of software are fine. But what you're going to discover, what we discovered, is just about every bookkeeping firm you're going to go and list will use QuickBooks, and they are not interested in training on or learning or managing these other solutions that are up and comers that you're DIYing. So what we learned when we were going out to look for a bookkeeping firm to get Angela some help a few years back now, the overwhelming majority of firms would say, "Oh, you're not on QuickBooks? Nah. Let us know if you migrate to QuickBooks and you want to work with us." That was the overwhelming majority of responses. Now, we did go out on Zoho Books and look for partners that were Zoho Books certified or whatever, willing to work with that. And it was crickets. We would reach out to them and get no response. It was almost impossible to find a bookkeeper that was willing to work on that platform. Now, the problem is, so what you could do is hire a virtual assistant later when you're, successful enough to want to pay someone else to keep your books, but you have to be the expert training that person. And when your finances get significant enough that you're going to bring in somebody, you don't want somebody that you're training in bookkeeping. You want somebody who's able to understand and push back and call things out. You don't want to be the expert and hiring essentially a junior employee because you are not an expert in bookkeeping. So at that time, you should be thinking about working with a bookkeeper or holistically a firm that can bring expertise to bear that you don't have. And all of the firms with that expertise are using QuickBooks and they want you on QuickBooks. Now you can, and we did, say, well, at that time, I'll make a transition. Even with hit subscribes books being relatively simple, we're still a services-based business. I mean, they're way more complicated than yours as a freelancer would be, but they're still simple as far as businesses go. Even with that, we were forced into a choice between either paying the bookkeeping firm, I don't remember. I want to say it was like $20,000 or $30,000 to do the migration out of our old piece of software. It's just that their billable rate taking care of everything, or paying them somewhat less and doing a lot of the heavy lifting ourselves. I believe we went that route, paying less, but still something, doing a lot of the heavy lifting ourselves, and then doing a kind of cutover where for historical archival purposes, we still have to go back to our old software. So we migrated in this whole set of transactions that occurred near the end of a tax year, and then did a cutover to a new piece of software, and still had to pay a bunch of money to do that migration. What I'm getting at is when there's historical stuff going on, when there's year-end bookkeeping for tax purposes and closing of the books and all this type of stuff, that archival information becomes not the most complicated conceptual thing in the world to move over, but time consuming. And there's aberrations that happen as you're trying to do a migration between these pieces of software. And just please take my word for it. If you get 4 or 5 years into Zoho Books or Xero or any of this other stuff and you want to switch to QuickBooks, it might seem conceptually simple to you as a programmer, but it will be more difficult than you think and way, way more expensive than you think. It will be the kind of thing that you regret at the time. And take that from me, because back in 2021 or 2020, whenever we were doing this, I regretted it. I said, I wish I hadn't pitched a fit about QuickBooks, fired it, and gone, I wish I had just stayed on QuickBooks. So that is why I won't really endorse QuickBooks as a piece of software. It's not my favorite, but just use QuickBooks. So anyway, to summarize there, my recommendation, I would DIY your finances for a little while to get your feet wet in the business finance department. I would start out keeping track of invoices on a spreadsheet, but then pretty quickly I would go to QuickBooks. And actually, out of curiosity, I pulled up their pricing here, and they've got something called Simple Start at $15 a month. So like, I think back when I was doing this, the cheapest plan was like 50 a month. And that wasn't actually the deal breaker for me. Anyway, it was just, it was a terrible user experience. It's gotten better. I actually don't mind QuickBooks anymore. But just in terms of the pool of people you will have to work with and draw on in terms of getting help later, there's just no competition. It's really, it does force your hand. I think that's not the best thing in the world, obviously, but just, I wouldn't fight it if I were you. I would just do QuickBooks. The only other thing I can think here to address maybe is, when do you switch from the spreadsheet to QuickBooks, which I covered, but then to doing it yourself in QuickBooks versus bringing in a bookkeeping firm. The spreadsheet, I would switch pretty quickly. Once you probably start to have some expenses, I would get on QuickBooks fairly quickly. When to switch over to a bookkeeper is really going to be up to you. It can be kind of almost a lifestyle decision. I mean, it's data entry that you're going to be doing at the end of the day. One inflection point might be if you start running into things that you don't fully understand or how to categorize expenses. If you start feeling uncomfortable, bringing in a bookkeeper with experience it can be valuable. So one inflection point might be that you start to have questions or be a little concerned that you're not doing things right. That can be a good moment to switch over to paying somebody. Another good moment to switching over might just be that the data entry becomes burdensome and you're spending way more time each week or month, like reconciling invoices and reconciling expenses than you want. And you think to yourself, gosh, I'd probably be better served to spend this time going out and making connections and landing new business. So when the time that you are sinking into that could be better spent generating revenue for your practice, that's another good inflection point. And, it just might be if bookkeeping turns into a miserable slog that makes you not want to deal with your business, that's no good. You are burning out your only employee and you don't want to do that. So you could sort of separate you, the business owner, from you, the employee, and ask yourself, am I making my employee miserable and torpedoing morale with this? And if you are, it's probably not worth doing it yourself. So hopefully that makes sense and really kind of covers the subject from all angles. So just to recap, what software should you use for your books? QuickBooks. Done. That's what I would do. If at any point, by the way, in this video, I have used Quicken and QuickBooks interchangeably, I definitely might have done that. My apologies. It's just that I used Quicken, which is the desktop-based personal software. I've used Quicken for the last 20 years. And so it's not that I think of those things interchangeably. It's just that Quicken has been such a part of my life for so long that I say Quicken. Quicken and QuickBooks are both by Intuit. They're very related pieces of software. It's just that Quicken is generally the personal one. QuickBooks is the professional one. So if I mix those two up, apologies. In all cases, I meant QuickBooks. I guess you could use Quicken Home. I wouldn't, though. I would just go right to QuickBooks if you're going to do that. So the answer to the question, what software should you use for books? QuickBooks. So hopefully that helps, and I will catch you all next time.